This is the assembly video for our Drive Rail 2 line of products. We'll be assembling a DR230-6. They're all very similar. The only difference is being the gear ratio. And today we'll be assembling a Drive Rail 2 with a low gear ratio. So, what's included in your Drive Rail 2 is it's going to be first the two first reduction gears after the motor pinion, and then your two sets of second reduction gears. You're going to have two sim spacers that attach on the motor. You're going to have 8 hex bearings, 8 washers, 8 quarter 20 by ½ inch screws, 4 1032 by 5/8 button head screws for the motors, 2 intermediate shafts, 2 output shafts, and then 2 ½ inch hex spacers. Also included will be your 2 motor pinion kits for the sim motor or sim style. They work with Neos as well. If you're using a Falcon 500, you're going to have to use a 12-tooth pinion or the 11-tooth pinion. To assemble your Drive Rail 2, you're only going to need 2 tools: an 1/8 inch hex key and a 5/32 hex key. While a T-handle does make this a little bit easier, you really only do need the hex keys. Alright, so to start off, we're going to take all of our ½ inch hex shafts and install a quarter 20 by ½ inch button head screw and a quarter inch washer into one end. They don't need to be tight, they just need to be screwed in so it doesn't fall apart as we're assembling it. We do recommend Loctiting all the screws after installation so that nothing unthreads during competition. Now that we have all the screws in the end, we can take some of our bearings, ½ inch hex bearing. Make sure you install it flange side towards the screw on these shafts, and you can do that for all of them. All right. Also, for your 2 output shafts, we can also install the ½ inch long hex spacer on each one. All right. Now, when you're assembling your Drive Rail 2, notice that on this side, these 2 holes are a lot bigger than this side. This is the side that the motor attaches to, and this is the side that you put the motor screws in from, which is why they're clearance holes for the head of that bolt. So make sure you understand that when you're assembling this. Here we're going to have the input side, so the side the motor gets attached on, facing this way. So the first thing you're going to do is take one of the gears that the pinion mates with and one of the shorter intermediate shafts. You're going to roll the gear down the inside of the tube until it lines up with the bearing hole, and then you can insert one of the shorter shafts into the hole. Now we can take the smaller of the 2 second stage gears, and on the low ratio, the gear is actually small enough that you can stick it in the bearing hole on the output side, and then you can install a bearing on that side as well, lining the hex up with the hex shaft and snapping the bearing in. Then we can take another screw assembly and thread it into the end of the shaft here, just hand tight. All right, now we take the output gear, or the larger of the 2 secondary stage gears, do the same thing. We roll it inside, and here you notice that this gear is actually closer to the output side and lines up with the smaller of the 2 gears. And then we can insert this shaft from the input side going out so that the ½ inch hex spacer can just be inserted along with the shaft. And pop this side of the bearing in, and grab another bearing and insert it on the outside. And then normally you would put your wheel assembly on, but we're just gonna put the screw in to hold everything assembled for now. Now you can skip ahead in the video at this point, but we are also going to be assembling this side as well. So to make it easy, same thing, input side is on this side, output side is on this side, motor attaches here. So the small holes are on this side, the big holes are on this side. And we're just going to do the same thing again. So input gear goes in, line up the hex, the smaller of the two shafts with it, insert the bearing, sometimes they are tight fit, but it's just because you install the bearing crooked. There we go. Same thing, small gear, hex bearing, and a screw. And then again with output gear, same thing, roll it down so it meshes with the small gear, and then snap the bearings in. And then install the far side bearing. The big thing when installing these bearings is making sure they go in square, so you might have to work your way around the bearing so it snaps in correctly. And then we can install another screw into the end just so that it doesn't fall apart as we're finishing assembly. So now your drive rail 2 should look like this. It'll have two gear systems set up. Now we're going to install our motors. If you noticed, the 5/32 hex key is just for tightening these shafts after assembly, or you can tighten these shafts now. And the next tool we're going to be needing is the 1/8" hex key. So if we take a motor, we're going to be using Sims for this. We have a Sim motor with our pinion already installed. If you notice on the Sims, they actually have a line marking on the top of the gearbox, on the top of the motor, showing you what direction the two threaded holes are. And so we want that up and down. So we take one of our Sim spacers and put it on the motor so that the two holes line up with the two threaded holes and the bearing is facing the outside. If you notice, that half moon will line up directly with the bearing in the inside of the drive rail. Then we can take one of our 1032 by 5/8, put it through the outside of the drive rail, and thread it into the motor. And then do the same thing again for the bottom screw in the motor. All right, and then you can snug both of them up. And do the same for your second sim motor. Find the mark, so it makes it easy to line up. Install your sim spacer over the end of the motor boss there. Insert it into the drive rail. You just have to spin it a little bit sometimes to get it to line up with the gear that's already in there. And then send your screws through and thread them into the motor. There we go. And then you can go back and snug both of those up. Then you go back, go through the whole gearbox, and snug all the hardware up on the intermediate shafts, making sure to snug up both sides of all the shafts. So, that is done. Your drive rail 2 is assembled. And now you can add whatever wheels you want. This is a DR2-30-6, so it's made for 6-inch macadam wheels like this. And then to attach them, attach a hub to the back, and then add your other shaft hardware and spacers to make this drive rail 2 complete. That concludes the assembly of our drive rail 2-30-6.